If you ever sat down at an Imperial typewriter, you'll remember the weight of it. The heavy metal clack of the keys, the carriage shoved back by hand, the bright little bell that rang at the end of every line. They were built to outlast the people who owned them. At its peak, Imperial employed around 2,500 workers in Leicester, held a royal warrant, and in 1970 recorded the highest export figures of any company in the country. It survived the Great War, when the works turned to making munitions. It survived the Depression. It survived the Second World War, supplying 150,000 machines to the armed forces. And it outlasted nearly every British rival, selling from Lagos to Lahore. It had come through everything the century could throw at it, and none of that is what killed it. Then, with the highest export figures in Britain still fresh on the books, both factories fell silent, and British typewriter manufacturing ended for good. How does the safest name in the country, a firm that survived all of it, simply vanish? How do you go from the top of the country to silence in a handful of years? Chapter 1. The Man Who Came from Marthasville. The story begins, as so many British industrial stories do, with someone who arrived from somewhere else. In 1881, a young man stepped off a ship onto an English quayside. He was barely 18, American by birth, with a Mexican father's surname and a head full of machines. He'd crossed an ocean to sell typewriters for the great American firm of Remington, to manage their office in a country that had only just begun to understand what a typewriter was for. His name was Hidalgo Moya. He would spend almost 40 years of his life in England. He would set in motion one of the best-loved manufacturing names this country ever produced, and he would die, decades later, in a boarding house by the sea, almost entirely forgotten. He was born in Marthasville, Missouri, in September 1863, the son of a Mexican father, John Moya. That paternal line is why he's so often called Spanish-American, or American-Spanish, a label that trailed him through his whole life and never quite fit. By birth and by passport, he was simply American, a citizen of the United States. His own patent papers say so plainly, but there was always something about Moya that resisted a single category, and the typewriter was only part of it. Because here was a man who didn't only build machines, he built hot air balloons and went up in them. He made violins by hand and cared about them enough to co-author a whole book on the subject, Violin Tone and Violin Makers, published in 1916, while he was supposed to be running a typewriter company. Picture that, the man charged with the survival of a precision engineering firm, turning over in his mind the way a horsehair bow draws sound from a length of spruce. He was, in the truest sense of the word, an inventor, someone for whom the world was a collection of problems waiting to be solved more elegantly, and the breadth ran in the blood. His son, John Hidalgo Moya, Jacko to everyone who knew him, born in California in 1920, would grow up to become one of Britain's most celebrated post-war architects, the man behind the Skylon, that impossible silver needle that hung over the 1951 Festival of Britain, seemingly without support. His daughter Georgia became a Fellow of the Royal Photographic Society. The Moyas were a family that made things, and made them beautifully. The tragedy of the father is that his children's fame would, in time, eclipse his own, almost entirely. How he came to typewriters at all is worth a moment. Before Remington, Moya had worked in connection with the Hammond Typewriter Organization in America, and Hammond's great idea was a thing called the type shuttle, an interchangeable unit you could swap to change the typeface. That notion lodged somewhere deep in the young man's imagination and never left. Years later, in a workshop in Leicester, it would resurface, transformed, as the single principle on which an entire British company would be built. Genius is often just a borrowed idea carried further than its originator dared. But first he had to get to Leicester, and he had to understand the city he'd landed in. Chapter 2. Leicester Clothes the World. The Leicester that Hidalgo Moya found his way to was not a city that did anything by halves. In the closing years of Victoria's reign, it was reckoned among the most prosperous manufacturing cities in all of Europe. They had a phrase for it, Leicester Clothes the World, and they meant it without irony. Hosiery and knitwear pouring out of the mills, boots and shoes by the wagon load, light engineering of every conceivable description. The town hummed with the particular confidence of a place that knew exactly what it was for, and was being paid handsomely to do it. Money was being made. Skilled hands were everywhere, Men who could read a drawing and turn a part to within a thou, women who could run a line all day without a wasted movement. It was, in short, exactly the kind of place where an ambitious idea might find both the talent and the cash to make it real. And into this came an American with a dream that was, on paper, almost laughably simple. He wanted to build a typewriter, a good one, and he wanted to sell it cheaply, not for the eye-watering sums the American giants charged, but for 5 guineas, £5 and 5 shillings, a machine that a clerk, a curate, a struggling author might one day actually afford to own. It was a dream entirely out of step with the market he was walking into. The British office machine trade was carved up between the Americans, Remington, Underwood, the mighty Royal, with the German makers crowding in behind them, and only a couple of homegrown names hanging on at the edges. There was Salter, out in West Bromwich, with its distinctive swing-up type bars, and there was Barlock, made in Nottingham, just up the road, a respectable machine with a loyal following. By the mid-1920s, those two firms and Imperial would be the only 3 companies still making typewriters in Britain at all. The American and German tide had washed almost everything else away. To swim against it, you needed capital, and Moyer, for all his gifts, had none. What he found instead was a man who believed in him. That belief would become the company. And the man's name was John Gordon Chataway. Chapter 3. 5 guineas and a borrowed factory. Chataway was a Leicester bootmaker, a prosperous one, born in 1854, a man who'd made real money out of the very trade the town was famous for. Quite what drew a hard-headed boot manufacturer to bankroll an eccentric American's typewriter is one of those things the record never fully explains. Perhaps Chataway had the manufacturer's instinct for a clever bit of engineering. Perhaps he simply liked the man. Moyer was, by every account, impossible not to like. What's certain is that he put up the money for a small factory on Garton Street, on a site now buried somewhere beneath Leicester Royal Infirmary, and he let Moyer get to work. Imagine that first workshop. Not the great brick monument the company would later raise on East Park Road, but a modest shop full of benches and lathes, the air sharp with cutting oil and hot metal, a handful of men bent over the fiddly, exacting business of making thousands of tiny steel parts fit together and move. This was where it started, not in a boardroom, at a bench. The bond between the two men went deeper than money. In 1905, Moyer married Chataway's daughter, Sophia Lillian. His financier had become his father-in-law. Whatever else you might say about the arrangement, it tied the dreamer and the money together as tightly as 2 men can be tied. The first machine appeared in 1902, the Moyer No. 1 used a rubber-type sleeve, that old Hammond idea, resurfacing at last, and it resembled the successful little Blickensderfer of the day. It was ingenious. It was also a commercial disappointment for a reason that tells you everything about the gap between a clever idea and a sellable product. The typing wasn't fully visible to the operator as they worked. You couldn't easily see your own words appear. And, at 5 guineas, the sums simply refused to balance. The dream of the cheap machine kept smashing into the cost of building a good one. So he tried again. The Moyer Visible, in 1905, moved the ribbon spools out to the sides so the typist could finally watch the words form on the page. It was a real improvement, a genuine step forward. And it still wasn't enough. The Moyer Typewriter Company ran out of road, ran out of cash, and the whole venture stood on the edge of quietly vanishing. One more good idea that didn't quite make it. And here is the moment the real story turns. On the 22nd of June, 1908, fresh money was found and a new company was registered. Moyer and Chataway were joined by 2 more Leicester businessmen, William Arthur Evans and Joseph Wallace Goddard, and together the 4 of them founded the Imperial Typewriter Company. The name was a statement of intent. This was to be a British machine for a British empire, and the early advertising made absolutely certain you understood it. One notice from those years stressed, with magnificent bluntness, that Imperial was not a naturalized newcomer from Germany. In a market thick with American and German hardware, patriotism wasn't a sentiment. It was a sales pitch, and Imperial sold it harder than anyone. The first machine to carry the new name was the Imperial Model A basic downstrike portable, the type bars striking down onto the paper from above. It weighed something close to 15 pounds with its cast-iron base, a serious lump of a thing to lug about. But buried inside it was the idea that would carry the company for the next half-century: interchangeability. Moyer had grasped, earlier and far more clearly than most, that a typewriter need not be a single fixed object. The parts could be made to lift out, swap over, exchange. He refined it relentlessly. The Model B of 1915 had a changeable type basket and twin shift keys. A planned aluminium-framed Model C cut the dead weight to around 9 pounds. The square keyboard Model D arrived in 1919. Each one pushed the principle a little further. It was an engineer's insight, pure and patient, and it would outlive its inventor by decades, which is the bitter heart of Moyer's story, because he didn't get to see what his idea became. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Founder. By 1911, the balance of power inside the young company had quietly shifted. Goddard and Evans, the money men, the ones with the commercial instincts and the appetite for control, took the reins, easing both Chataway and Moyer away from the centre of the business they'd founded. It was not dramatic. There was no great betrayal, no shouting match recorded for posterity. It was the ordinary, almost gentle way that founders are so often moved aside once the thing they founded learns to walk without them. And Moyer's health was failing badly. A series of strokes had begun to take him apart, piece by piece, the way illness does. His role as works manager passed to a Swedish-born engineer named Erik Julius Pillblad, a capable man who would steady the works through difficult years. And Moyer, the dreamer, the balloonist, the violin maker, the man who'd carried an idea across an ocean, found himself increasingly on the outside of his own creation. Around 1920, he went back to America, to Pasadena and Los Gatos in California, hoping the warmth and the light might mend what England's damp had not. It didn't. He returned to England in 1921, no better, and on a December day in 1927, Hidalgo Moyer died in Bournemouth, aged 64, in obscurity, his name already fading from the company that bore the dream he'd given it. Think of the timing. His son was within a few years of designing the Skylon, the most talked-about structure in post-war Britain. His company was on the cusp of conquering the Commonwealth, and the man who had lit the whole fuse died in a seaside boarding house, very nearly unknown, in the same decade that his most famous machine was about to take shape. That might easily have been the end of the whole tale. A clever idea, a forgotten founder, a small firm among larger and louder ones, slowly squeezed out by the Americans and the Germans. What the company needed now, more than capital or patriotism or a royal name, was somebody to take Moyer's principle and turn it into an empire, and that man had already been on the payroll for 7 years. Chapter 5. The Man Who Chromed His Own Car. Arthur Bott Patterman had walked through the Garton Street gates in 1904, joining Moyer's assembly department as a young man of 18. He was not a founder. He was not a financier. He was the kind of figure British industry produced again and again and then somehow forgot to celebrate. The worksman, the one who knows the machine from the inside out, who can tell you what's wrong with it from the sound it makes across the floor. Over the decades, he climbed every rung there was. General manager by 1923, managing director by 1939, chairman of the board by 1956. For the better part of 50 years, Imperial Typewriter and Arthur Patman were very nearly the same thing. He was also, by any reasonable measure, a glorious eccentric. Patman's hobby was cars, though not driving them exactly, so much as taking them apart. He'd buy a motor car, strip it down to the bare chassis, send the moving parts off to be chromed, and rebuild the whole thing to his own exacting standard. A Patmanized car was a known and admired quantity among the people who knew him, and then there's the story they still tell about him. He once rebuilt a car in an upstairs room of his house and discovered, as men of his particular sort occasionally do, that he had no way of getting the finished thing back out. The solution was pure Patman. He removed his attic, he removed his own front doors, and he extracted the car. This was a man who solved problems by sheer force of will and did not greatly care what the house looked like afterward. Hold that image, because that exact temperament was about to go into the machine that saved the company. In 1926, Patman designed Imperial's first standard-sized typewriter, not a portable, a full, heavy office machine, the sort that sat on a desk and stayed there. He called it the Model 50, and into it he poured Moyer's old principle of interchangeability, but executed now with a confidence the founder himself had never quite reached. Here was the problem Paterman set out to solve. A typewriter built to serve an empire had to cope with 100 different scripts, a dozen different jobs, carriages of every width for every size of ledger and letter. The usual answer was to build 100 different machines. Paterman's answer was to build one and make its insides swap. The Model 50 was a front strike machine, the type bars rising to strike the front of the platen where the typist could see every word the instant it landed, and with the flick of a couple of switches, the entire keyboard and type basket, the whole writing assembly, pulled cleanly out of the body of the machine. The carriage detached too. In seconds, not minutes, seconds, an operator could change the width of the carriage, swap to a different font, switch to an entirely different language, or simply lift the working parts out to clean and service them. Think about what that meant for a firm selling across an empire of 100 tongues. A single basic machine could be a Greek typewriter one week and a chemistry typewriter the next, fitted with whatever exotic characters and symbols the buyer required. Imperial advertised exactly this at the British Industries Fair, that great showcase of the nation's manufacturing might. Appearing there in 1922, again in 1929 and again in 1947, its notices promising special keyboards made for engineers, for chemists, for the speakers of any language under the sun. No rival could match the sheer flexibility of it. Paterman had taken a dying man's clever idea and forged it into a competitive weapon, and the design was so fundamentally right that it barely needed to change. The Model 50 became the Model 55 in 1937, the 58 in 1948, the 60 in 1949, the 65 in 1952, the 66 in 1954. There was even a twin keyboard oddity, the so-called doppelganger of 1957, developed with an engineer named Claude Brumhill, and a Model 70 in 1962. The lineage ran nearly unbroken for the better part of 40 years. One basic mechanism, refined and rebodied and renamed, but recognizably the same brilliant idea, sold by the hundreds of thousands. By the standards of British manufacturing, it was an astonishing run of stability. By the standards of the technological revolution coming over the horizon, it would one day look like a company that had simply stopped moving. But that reckoning lay decades off. And in the meantime, Paterman's Model 50 made Imperial something close to indestructible, in reputation, and very nearly in fact. These were machines built to outlast their owners. Solid metal, round inlaid keys, a carriage return bell that rang bright and clear across a busy office. People did not so much use an Imperial as live alongside one. The company had learned its first great lesson. Build something that lasts. Now it learned a second, one every great manufacturer eventually learns. A great product needs a great name. Chapter 6. Write like Priestley. Around 1928, Imperial began a quiet collaboration that would give it its most famous machine of all. The partner was a German firm, Torpedo of Rödelheim, near Frankfurt, and there is a certain irony in that, given how loudly Imperial had once trumpeted its freedom from German competition. But business is business, and good design is good design. The connection ran through an English design engineer named Herbert Etheridge, who would later move to Leicester and join Imperial outright. Etheridge's loyalty to the company, and to one man in particular, ran extraordinarily deep. When he died in 1940, he left his entire estate to Arthur Pateman. The first fruit of the torpedo link was a neat little portable the Germans had built for export, called the Regent. Imperial bought the rights to it, and then someone in Leicester had an idea worth more than any patent. In 1929, the novelist J.B. Priestley had published The Good Companions, a warm, sprawling, hugely popular novel that had become a genuine national sensation. Imperial approached him, secured his blessing, and rechristened the little machine The Good Companion. When the first one came off the line in 1932, it was presented to the great man himself, and a marketing line was born that practically wrote itself: buy an Imperial Good Companion and write like Priestley. It worked because it was true to something real. The Good Companion was exactly that, a portable, dependable writing partner, the machine you carried up to the spare room to write your novel, or your dissertation, or your letters home. The series ran through model after model: the T, the 3, the 4, the 5, the 6, and the 7, right up to 1963, and the company's standing climbed alongside it. When a machine was sold to Buckingham Palace, Imperial earned the right to style itself a supplier by royal appointment. For a British manufacturer trading on patriotism and quality, no endorsement on earth was worth more. But it would be wrong to imagine these decades as nothing but steady growth and royal warrants. Twice in its first half-century, the company stared hard at something that could have finished it, and twice it came through. Chapter 7. The War Model. The first test came with the Great War. When the fighting began in 1914, the Leicester Works did what factories full of skilled metalworkers across the country did. It turned its lathes and presses over to munitions, making weapons for the front instead of typewriters for the office. It was survival by adaptation, and it taught the company a lesson it would draw on again a generation later. The very precision needed to build a typewriter, the tolerances and the tooling and the disciplined hands, could be bent to almost any purpose a nation at war demanded. A firm that could make a type bar could make a great many other things besides. The second test was longer and quieter, and in its way more dangerous, because there was no clear enemy to turn the lathes against. It was the depression of the 1930s, the slump that broke firms far larger and far older than Imperial, and it was here that Pateman's Model 50 truly earned its keep. A reliable, repairable, endlessly configurable machine was precisely what a cash-strapped, anxious world still found the money for. When you cannot afford to replace, you buy the thing that lasts. The Model 50 was that thing. It carried the order books through the lean years when so many others closed their gates for good. And then, in 1939, the world went to war again, and Imperial discovered that the typewriter itself had become a weapon of sorts. An army runs on paper, on orders and dispatches, requisitions and reports, the vast, ceaseless documentation of organized violence. And so typewriter production was declared a priority of the very highest order. Over the course of the war, Imperial supplied something in the region of 150,000 machines to the armed services of the Crown. The rugged, dependable Model 50, the machine that had survived the Depression, now went to war, and the men who hammered their orders out on it gave it a nickname that stuck. They called it the War Model. Somewhere in a desert headquarters or a Whitehall basement, the clack and ring of a Leicester-built Imperial was part of the sound of Britain at war. By the time peace returned in 1945, the company had survived 2 world wars and a global depression. It had outlasted nearly all of its British rivals, and it had built a reputation that stretched clear across the Commonwealth. For it enjoyed tariff protection throughout the empire, and Pateman's interchangeable keyboards meant it could meet the demand for every script and language those far-flung markets threw at it. Imperial wasn't merely the machine of choice in much of that world, it was the brand the governments themselves stood behind. Demand grew so strong that in 1954, the company opened a second factory, far to the northeast, in Hull, timed to coincide with the launch of the new Model 66. From then on, the standard office machines would be built in Leicester, the portables up in Hull. 2 factories now, thousands of workers, a royal warrant on the letterhead, the highest priority in 2 world wars behind it, and Imperials clacking away in offices from Lagos to Lahore. The dreamer from Marthasville had been dead for nearly 30 years, but the company he'd started with 5 guineas and a borrowed factory on Garton Street was no longer a struggling concern fighting for its life against the Americans. It was about to enter its golden age.